Turning points. Stephen Carroll's here. Turning points in taxis we're talking about. In fact, the government's trying to bring an end to these protests by taxi drivers, isn't it?
That's right. Is it a 3-point turn or not? Well, taxi drivers in France have been protesting for well over a year now against what they say is unfair competition from rival services like Uber. In an effort to address their concerns, the government's offering to buy back taxi licences from drivers who say they can no longer make a living. A Paris taxi medallion costs more than €100,000 to buy, and many drivers take out huge loans to purchase them. But who'll pay for this new scheme? Well, Alexander Alcott now explains.
After months of conflict, the French government has played its final card, trying to remove fuel from the fire of angry taxi drivers. In an unprecedented move, the government has vowed to buy back taxi drivers' licences at a guaranteed price. So, for example, if a driver bought his licence for €150,000 in 2005, the state would buy it back for the same amount, taking into account inflation. The aim is to calm a profession that sees itself as the victim of private chauffeur cars, known as VTCs, like Uber, which don't have to pay expensive taxi licences. Many taxi drivers in Paris showed relief, but not enthusiasm for the new fund.
The fact they guarantee they'll buy back the licence is a good thing.
It's important for taxi drivers not to buy back the licence, but to find a solution for the future of taxis.
The licences cost a small fortune. The average is about €160,000 in Paris, but they can go as high as €350,000. So how will the government afford to buy them back? Not using public finances, they say. The €2 to €5 billion they need will come from taxing VTCs as well as taxis themselves, something that's shocked the taxi unions.
The fund will be fed by money from taxi drivers. The state, it's explained, will not contribute a single cent. So to pretend to find a solution with public funds or to find a solution at all, it's rubbish.
The government hopes the new fund will end the taxi strikes that have brought multiple French cities to a standstill in recent months. But of the country's 55,000 taxis, this will only benefit those who plan to retire or quit the profession.
Going to stay in France now. Controversial plans to reform employment law going to be discussed in Parliament today, Steve.
Yeah, it's a parliamentary committee that's going to examine the bill after MPs proposed more than 800 amendments to it. Now, it seeks to overhaul the rules around hiring and firing workers, as well as allowing employers more flexibility to negotiate issues around working conditions directly with staff. We were talking about the protests a little earlier that were taking place in Paris last night. There are more protests planned by student unions later today against these changes.
OK, let's have a look at the markets then. What's happening?
Japanese shares didn't have a great day. The Nikkei in Tokyo closed down over 2% at the end of trading. Chinese markets back in business after being closed on Monday. Shanghai, as you can see, up by over 1%, but the Hang Seng in Hong Kong down by over 1%. We're keeping an eye on what's happening on the oil price as well. Oil prices have been sliding and trading again today, dipping back below $38 a barrel on the Brent crude index. This is over dwindling fears that oil producers will agree to cut output at a meeting later this month.
Now, there were several major banks named in the Panama Papers, of course, as having set up offshore companies for their clients. Now, Credit Suisse is the latest to comment on this controversy.
It was one of the really interesting elements of the Panama Papers leak was how much those big banks were involved in pushing offshore companies. Well, Credit Suisse's chief executive says that they only use those offshore companies where there was a legitimate economic purpose. Speaking at an investment conference in Hong Kong, Tidjam Thiam said that Credit Suisse only used them for very wealthy customers, and they always insisted on knowing the identities of all the people involved. The Panama Papers revealed that banks had asked law firm Mossack Fonseca to set up more than 15,000 offshore companies for them. Some more of the day's business headlines for you next. More than $20 billion was wiped off the value of drugs company Allergan on Monday after the US government announced new proposals to prevent so-called tax inversion deals. Allergan's in the midst of a $160 billion takeover by Irish-based Pfizer, which would substantially cut its tax bill, but rule changes by the US Treasury may now scupper that deal. The British government is in talks with metals firm Liberty over a possible takeover of Tata Steel's operations in the UK. Tata's been selling off its British assets where losses have been building in recent months. The focus is on the Welsh plant in Port Talbot, where thousands of jobs are at risk.
And finally from Stephen, the controversy over Air France cabin crew flying to Iran has been resolved.
That's right, female cabin crew at the airline had complained after being asked by the company to wear a veil once they landed in Iran. Air France flights to Tehran are due to resume on April 17th after an 8-year hiatus. But the cabin crew have now reached an agreement where staff can simply refuse to work the Iranian routes without fear of being penalised.
OK, thank you very much, Stephen. Stephen with business here on France 24.